District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I am your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. I don't know about you, but April has zipped by so quickly. There are a lot of rules being handed down from the different regulatory agencies ahead of May 22nd, presumably the May 22nd deadline for the Congressional Review Act. So you're seeing a lot of rules, particularly bad rules, being handed down from all the different agencies as it relates to this program: Department of Energy, EPA, Department of Interior, and its subsidiary agencies like BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, yada, yada, yada. Today I'm going to focus on 3 rules that were recently issued in their final form, and I expanded on this for my Town Hall VIP column, but I'm going to briefly zip through the Clean Power Plan or Clean Power Plan 2.0 rule that came down from the EPA and why I think that's a very misguided policy with respect to grid stability. We're going to talk again about the BLM Conservation and Landscape Rule, and now they've changed conservation leases to mitigation and reclamation leases. Then I'm going to round it out with overview of the Renewable Energy Rule under BLM, which will basically give solar and wind developers an unfair advantage with an 80% developers fee discount to rush ahead with putting up all these different projects across public lands, including what they hope to do, the Western Solar Plan, which would blanket potentially, if they got their way, 22 million acres, open up 22 million acres across 11 states to solar projects, which is a disaster in the making if you are a conservationist, you care about land stewardship, and you already know and recognize the downfalls of intermittent energy, which has been tried before, and that really is inferior to sources like nuclear and even conventional energy like coal, oil, and natural gas. Let's be frank there. All right, let's begin with this Clean Power Plan 2.0 rule and what this entails. Not surprisingly, in my opinion, I expected a very bad outcome from this rule. It's a very controversial rule. It really goes against the West Virginia versus EPA ruling that said that the EPA cannot regulate pollution like this, where you destabilize the grid, closing down perfectly good existing coal plants, and potentially shut down natural gas plants. So if you need an understanding of that tie-in, I'll include the ruling there. But this particular rule says that unless existing coal plants and new natural gas plants reduce their carbon emissions cumulatively by 90% by 2032. Again, those arbitrary deadlines, which are impractical, you won't see any decrease of this grade then, because it goes along very unsustainable, unobtainable net zero goals. This is where this all stems from the day one executive order to basically, quote, decarbonize the grid, to decarbonize public lands, to decarbonize every facet of life, essentially, which, if you're a rational thinking person, you understand that you can't eliminate carbon. You can steward it better, but carbon is an essential element of life, and it would be tomfoolery to get rid of it, especially if you're leaning on intermittent sources that are subsidized. But I digress. Let's go back to this rule. So this would imperil 60% of the U.S.'s generating capacity on the electric grid, coal and natural gas combined. And it would force existing coal plants and natural gas plants to shut down unless they partake in carbon capture or install similar emissions control technologies. Now, I know some of my friends in the center-right are touting carbon capture, and they're very excited about that. They want to see, permitting reform to unleash it more. But as it stands currently, this technology can't be scalable quite yet, given the red tape. And there's also kind of unknowns about the process, if we're being honest. I don't know too much about it. I'm a natural skeptic. And I think mandating carbon capture would irk a lot of people who support the potential development and deployment of carbon capture. And I'm not privy to support mandates, so this outright is not something I can support. Also, I defer to serious sources like the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, and in their December 2023 long-term assessment report, they warned that environmental regulations and energy policies that are overly rigid and lack provisions for electric grid reliability have the potential to influence generators to seek deactivation despite a projected resource adequacy or operating reliability risk. So we will see definitely this rule be challenged by the same people who challenged West Virginia versus EPA. Again, the EPA exceeding its bounds here, not surprising. And again, with this insistence to move away from fossil fuels in a forcible manner to plants that are not reliable, like solar and wind and other unproven clean energy technologies, if they were serious, they would pivot to nuclear, even geothermal, keep these existing sources too, but they're not serious because they're so beholden to net zero. All rationale is thrown out the window under this thinking. So this rule, very problematic, and you don't have to be a diehard fossil fuel proponent to realize that this is not a practical thing to implement, especially when you don't have something to replace it with. The final BLM Conservation, Landscape, and Health rule, that's a mouthful to say every time I talk about this issue, but I've been on top of this. I was printed in the Wall Street Journal on this very subject, and I am very concerned with facets of this public lands rule, and here's why I am. As a conservationist, it sounds nice that they claim that they want to put the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, that they want to put conservation on equal footing with multiple use management of public lands. I've argued in other articles that conservation is already inherently implied in multiple use management of public lands. It states very clearly in FLIPMA that conservation has to be practiced. It may not be overt, and some of my friends and some other organizations may say, well, what about like a free market or Republican response to this to create conservation leases? Republicans are not in support of this BLM planning rule. They were not in support of it previously. I don't see any appetite with how this is structured and phrased that there would be Republican support, even conservative conservationist support for this in the near future, just with how top down this is, how unclear about what conservation leases are. I feel that this administration, the Biden administration, will particularly favor certain nonprofits over others when offering or leasing conservation leases or mitigation leases or reclamation leases, as they're now calling this, because they're giving preference to preservationist environmental groups that want to lock out access to grazers, ranchers, hunters, recreational anglers, ATV, OTVers, and the like. Your traditional multiple use user is not going to benefit from my assessment into this under this rule. So the original rule under section 6102.4A3, it would authorize renewable energy projects on BLM lands. The BLM and project proponent may agree to compensate for loss of wildlife habitat by restoring or enhancing other habitat areas. It also added that a conservation lease could be used to put compensatory mitigation dollars to work restoring compromised landscapes. So we could have, hypothetically speaking, solar and wind companies destroying high quality habitat with the promise that they're going to restore nearby lesser habitat. Does not sound like conservation to me. It sounds like giving them permission or the green light to destroy nature under the guise of protecting nature. And then you're going to have even worse of a environmental toll on the land than, let's say, conventional energy, so to speak. But I don't think every parcel of federal land should be developed for energy development. But it's not smart to just give, as the BLM Director Tracy Stone-Manning said early in her tenure, right after she was confirmed, that she wants multiple use management to be strictly focusing on clean energy such as solar and wind. And I can link to this if you don't take me at face value for this, but this is what she said she wants to orient multiple use to be, away from coal, oil, and natural gas to solar and wind. And instead of conservation leases, the agency in their final rule went with restoration and mitigation leases. So they think they can deceive us, of course. And to me, as I argue in town hall, it's very troubling. How they justify this now is appropriate places for restoration and mitigation leasing on public lands include degraded habitats in need of restoration, as well as intact landscapes and functioning ecosystems that can serve as compensatory mitigation for a particular action. For example, as part of authorizing a renewable energy project on public lands,
BLM and project proponent may agree to compensate for loss of habitat wildlife by restoring or enhancing other habitat areas, and a mitigation lease could be used to protect the restoration and enhancement actions. Now, we have the Western Solar Plan looming, 22 million acres across 11 states that could be potentially destroyed in the name of going net zero, pivoting net zero, catalyzing solar, what have you. And environmentalists have been very silent about this. They've had their silence bought off by these various different companies, not surprising, but I was very surprised to see, as I've mentioned before, groups like BHA, TRCP actually sounded the alarm against this preferred alternative Western Solar Plan, which would include and encompass 22 million acres. So I don't think conservation groups like RMEF and others that actually have good intentions with potentially a conservation lease, I don't think they're going to be able to bid on these leases whatsoever. I think the government is going to give undue influence to preservationist groups that want to lock out access. And I'm not privy to this idea of creating non-uses on public lands, because if you create non-uses, then you don't have forest management, you don't have, certain activities. I just think if you want to create non-uses, create wilderness habitat by all means. That's where non-uses are, and very strictly managed public lands like that. But to make BLM land into non-uses would defeat what multiple use BLM land is. It's supposed to be open for multiple uses. And conservation is not preservation or creating a non-use out of land, in my opinion. That's just what I think when I am interpreting conservation. This rule is also legally questionable. This has been put out there by different senators, lawyers from the land side, former Department of Interior lawyers and experts who have said that they've pointed to precedents that actually, if a rule was invalidated by the Congressional Review Act, which BLM 2.0, which is a predecessor to this law, not very different, a lot of parallels and very much similarities here. If you have, very simply put, a rule that was invalidated by Congress and then also by the president signing the CRA to revoke as President Trump did in 2017, legally, the BLM cannot create this rule. And you're going to see this rule challenged on those grounds because the CRA was invoked previously for a similar rule, almost word for word. And you just can't do that under Congress. And BLM really shouldn't be crafting these rules. This should be Congress amending FLPMA. It's within their jurisdiction to do that. The BLM nor the president should be rewriting congressional rules and congressional laws, not in their purview. And that is why you're going to see West Virginia versus EPA, that decision really being emphasized in challenges to rules like this. And then I think the Chevron deference will put like a final nail in the coffin to this, kind of unknown regulatory authority that agencies have and limit and clamp down on how much rulemaking power they can have. So we will see hopefully by June a clamping down of this, but this is not a way to build trust with people, especially as you see BLM in Utah and other states closing down access on Bears Ears, potentially in their preferred alternative to the whole area, no recreational shooting, no predator hunting, things of that sort. And then you see also closures to Big Cypress National Preserve in Florida under the National Park Service, where they're going to make and designate, I think, 120 some odd thousand acres of the 760,000 acres of this National Park Service land into wilderness habitat, despite the tribes there, hunters, airboaters, educators sounding the alarm and saying that wilderness habitat would be inappropriate there. Could I support the notion of a conservation lease? Not at this time. To be honest with you, I just don't trust the government to do this, and I think this gives the government outsized influence to determine and be the final arbiter of conservation. We see this with the American Climate Corps, where jobs in conservation would be emanating from the federal government in partnership with nonprofits and not in the private sector. That is a detriment to conservation. So anything that gives the government more power here, I don't trust them to steward multiple use in this way. And again, you go back to Tracy Stone-Manning's words after getting confirmed, even though she narrowly got confirmed, she wants multiple use to pivot to a clean energy future. Her words, not mine. And speaking of so-called clean energy, intermittent, unreliable, but nice sounding solar and wind, the renewable energy rule surprisingly is slipping under the radar. I'm surprised this hasn't received more coverage. Understandably, members of Congress are responding to dozens of different rules, so I understand maybe they aren't able to give and award attention here because they're dealing with so much asininity with respect to all the finalized rules, again, ahead of this May 22nd deadline for the CRA, for the Congressional Review Act. But I'm going to help bring you up to speed about this rule and why I find it to be troubling. Again, with this insistence to go and pivot towards net zero, which will never be achieved, especially when you look at, okay, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is not inflation reducing because discouraging investment and promotion of conventional energy development is passing on increased costs to producers who then pass on their cost to consumers, all in the mix with environmental, social, and governance posturing, especially the E-prong, which is why you're seeing with this pivot to net zero and hasty moving away from conventional energy, coal, oil, and natural gas, and even nuclear, to these unreliable but allegedly scalable energy sources. You're seeing your prices at the pump increase. You're seeing your utility bills go up. You're seeing grid instability going back to this Clean Power Plan rule. And this is so egregious and representative of big government gone awry. And the fact that this does not have more outreach to the renewable energy rule is infuriating to me, personally speaking. And solar and wind companies are benefiting greatly from IRA monies. They have apparently all these energy subsidies originally were tapped to be $323 billion. I think there was an increase in $428 billion, so it's close to $1 trillion to subsidize clean energy, so-called clean energy projects. Yet, there is no responding market reaction, favorable market reaction, or consumer interest in these products. Different news outlets, which are generally favorable and kind of kissing up to these clean energy companies, or they disclose that they're getting or are sponsored by clean energy companies like Ørsted and what have you, they're even now having to report the ugly side to these subsidies from the IRA, net zero, ESG posturing, that it is not driving consumer interest in investing in solar, wind, EVs, batteries, what have you. You actually see the opposite reaction happening. You see people gravitating back towards traditional, reliable sources. People want nuclear. But this is how egregious this renewable energy rule is. So they're going to give a 80% discount on developer fees for acreage rents and capacity fees. It would deploy clean energy on public lands and achieve a so-called national goal of 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035. Let me read more from the rule. If you're doubtful, I'm not pulling this out of thin air. I take all my sources from the horse's mouth itself, metaphorically speaking, from these government agencies. They've claimed that they've updated their regulations to promote responsible development of solar and wind energy on public lands, reduces acreage, rents, and capacity fees, improves the BLM's application process, and delivers greater predictability for how the BLM will administer future solar and wind authorizations. The Energy Act of 2020 authorized the BLM to reduce acreage rents and capacity fees to promote wind and solar development, which the BLM initially implemented through guidance in 2022. The final rule codifies further reductions in acreage rents and reduces capacity fees by 80% in comparison with the rates under the 2016 rule through 2035, and then transitions to a 20% reduction for 2038 and beyond. As they claim, this will be improving financial predictability for developers pursuing long-term projects on public land. And I can tell you, having investigated different wind and solar projects or just observed different collapsing and cancellation and opposition to solar and wind projects across, proposed solar and wind projects across BLM land, local red state areas where they're wanting to put these projects do not support this. It's not just Republicans, it's also Democrats. They feel like they're being forced to have these projects, that they're not being properly consulted, and then they see that they're going to be shored with the cancellation costs. Then they'll see higher utility bills, and of course, the project won't get off the ground. I want to point you to an article that my friend and colleague Sarah Montalbano did for us at our Independent Women's Forum Center for Energy and Conservation. She wrote about this. Ultimately, this is what the rule will bear on taxpayers. Taxpayers are being shortchanged by being deprived of the fair market value of land rentals. What's worse is that the renewable energy projects already rely heavily on subsidies and tax breaks to survive. Furthermore, special treatment will not overcome grid connection challenges and the substantial land requirements of solar and wind compared to coal and natural gas-fired plants. Imagine if nuclear was able to be unleashed, it would blow, metaphorically speaking, maybe physically speaking, solar and wind out of the water with the competition and reliability. Nuclear provides across a year about 93% reliability. It's on 93% of the year. Solar and wind don't even have anywhere near that level of reliability. If you're not for nuclear, you're unserious about actual clean energy solutions. That's the true clean energy solution. And you can still support and encourage the production of coal, oil, and natural gas because, ironically, they're still needed and they back up these projects, especially wind turbine projects. When I was in Washington State recently, heading from Vancouver to the Tri-Cities area, when you're driving from the Columbia River Basin into the kind of like eastern Washington region, into the Plains region, you see turbines blanket the hills. It's an ugly sight. And ironically, you see oil dripping, oil stains on the turbines. So you know that these cannot be powered without fossil fuels, ironically speaking. If solar and wind, utility scale and solar or wind are cutting edge technologies, why do they need subsidies to back them up and get them online? That's the question a lot of people should be asking. And they've been doing this since the Obama era, maybe even as far back as the Bush era too. So this is something that hasn't proven itself. It's costly even without the subsidies. It's intermittent, it's unreliable, and it gobbles up so much land. And oh my gosh, the wildlife impact. Let's not kid ourselves about the wildlife impact onshore and offshore with these supposedly clean energy technologies. Nuclear uses a fraction of the land. It powers 24/7 baseload power. But naturally, the Biden administration is picking winners and losers, again, because they're giving preferential treatment to solar and wind EV battery companies because they're their buddies. But you're going to see similar collapses like Solyndra from 2009, I believe. If I recall correctly, maybe 2011. We're going to see a lot of mini Solyndras. These companies cannot function on their own. They're not market-driven, and the consumers do not want these so-called clean energy technologies. They're clamoring for stuff that's more reliable, and because these sources overpower the grid, states have to gravitate, individuals have to gravitate towards traditional energy. If you're curious to see every EPA, DOE, DOI rule, I will include in the show notes the unified agenda from the Office of Management and Budget and their subsidiary, and you can explore for yourself. Sadly, it's going to be headache-inducing to review all those rules, but if you are a patient person, I say go for it. I've examined a few for myself, but this is something to be aware of in the regulatory state, as I mentioned earlier. If not for West Virginia versus EPA, I think Chevron is going to put a final clamp on regulatory agencies exceeding their bounds to create rules which they have no authority over. That power rests in Congress, because we need Congress to be reforming or amending rules, not agencies.
Thanks for listening to District of Conservation. If you enjoyed what you heard today, go leave us some reviews on Apple and Spotify or wherever podcasts are played. Your feedback will help us reach more people, and I love to know what is on your mind after each episode. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat or a guest announcement, because that is our way of updating all of you listeners, and we have just hit 1,000 followers on Instagram for the podcast account. Thank you very much. And if you have any guest suggestions or topics you want to hear on the show, I am all ears. I would love to hear your feedback there. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.